One of the things I would like to try to make clear in characterizing my relations with Gene, what he must have found very difficult, is my Moses Joshua theory of creativity. There are people in the world who create universes where there were none. They bring into being something that was never there before. Having done that, they don't always possess the mundane managerial skills needed to run what they've brought into being. They have a kind of messianic vision and a charisma that the rest of us don't have. Moses is the prime example. But when Moses gets to the River Jordan, God taps him on the shoulder, gives him a gold watch, and says, "Thank you very much for your service. Joshua is going to take it from here." And Joshua, he's not really a prophet like Moses. He doesn't have that charisma. Joshua sends spies into the land of Canaan. Joshua fights the battle of Jericho, but he's a kind of a can-do man. And Moses is going to have to let go. He doesn't get to cross the river. And I think to some degree, what Gene had brought into being and oversaw was now going to morph. It may morph for the better, it may morph for the worse, but it was going to be different. So I think it must have been very difficult, very wrenching for him to watch me taking over and doing slightly different things. I was asked for many years, what were your interactions with Gene Roddenberry? And my stock answer was they were very slight. He was not involved in the making of Star Trek II, but you met him, and I did meet him, and that's what my recollection was. Well, that was wrong. My memory was wrong, because I went back to the University of Iowa, where my papers are kept. And there, they put on display for my visit a whole bunch of Star Trek memorabilia, including all these memorandums between Gene Roddenberry and myself about the script, which he hated. And I read these toxic, on both sides, I might add, him accusing, and this is terrible, and me being fresh and disrespectful. And I had blocked all of it. My vision of human nature and perfectibility was very different from Gene's. He espoused, or he claimed to espouse, I don't know to what degree he believed what he espoused, the perfectibility of human beings. I've yet to see any evidence. So my vision was considerably darker. I think it was very important to him that Starfleet and the Federation were benign institutions. And I said, well, it kind of looks like gunboat diplomacy to me. He saw it as the Coast Guard. I saw it as the Navy. There is no right or wrong, it just is. And I don't know how much I responded to Star Trek, but I sure responded to Harve Bennett. We got on like a house on fire. And so he showed me the first Star Trek movie, and he showed me some of the episodes. And I liked Harve. I still didn't quite understand what I was seeing. But it did vaguely remind me of something that I liked, which were these books that I read. Maybe I was 13 when I read all the Captain Horatio Hornblower novels of C.S. Forrester's, the guy who wrote The African Queen as well. So I said, oh, this is Hornblower in outer space. I know how to do that. And that's how I became involved in it. And once I had that Hornblower idea up my tush, It was all going to be about the Navy. I have in other places likened Star Trek creators and creations to variations of the Catholic Mass. We all know the text of the Catholic Mass. We know the Kyrie and the Dies Irae and the Hosannas and so forth. But depending on who's writing the music, it sounds so different that you would never recognize that it was the same words. Put another way, here's the bottle. You can pour any vintage into this bottle you want, but it's got to be the shape of this bottle. That's it. And I tried to respect the shape of the bottle. I tried to respect the text of the Catholic Mass, if you like. But the music was going to be mine. The wine was going to be mine. So what I remember is that Harve Bennett and I settled up that I would like to direct a second Star Trek movie, and he said draft 5 is coming in, and I'll give it to you when it does. And I waited, and I looked up, and it was weeks later. I don't know if it was 3 weeks later, 5 weeks later. I remembered the project, and I was jonesing to make an outer space opera, and I called him up and said, whatever happened to draft 5? And he said, in rather more colorful language than I'm using now, I can't send it to you. It's not very good. And I said, what about draft 4 or 3? And he said, you don't understand. The 5 drafts of this proposed movie are merely 5 discrete attempts to get a second Star Trek movie into the starting gate. They're not related. And I said, well, can you send them all and let me read them? And he said something to the effect that if it's your funeral, and in those days you didn't hit send, a van would pull up, and it was way more than 5 scripts because there were all the rewrite versions of it, and I am a very slow reader. So I just started plowing through these scripts. And at the end of that, I invited Harve Bennett and his producing partner, Robert Sallin, to my place in Laurel Canyon. We sat down and I pulled out a legal pad and I said, I have an idea. And my idea is, why don't we make a list of everything in these 5 scripts that we like? It could be a major plot point. It could be a subplot. It could be a sequence. It could be a scene. It could be a character. It could be a line of dialogue. I don't care. Let's just make that list. And then I'll try to write a new screenplay and incorporate as many of these things in the laundry list as I can. And they didn't look happy. And I said, what's the problem? And they said, the problem is that unless we give ILM, the special effects house that are going to do the effects for the movie, a screenplay in 12 days, they can't guarantee delivery of the shots in time for the June opening. And I said, what June opening? And they said, well, the picture is supposed to open on some day in June. I said, it is? You booked the theater and the movie into a theater and there's no movie? I said, well, I think I can do this in 12 days. And they still didn't look happy. And I said, now what's the problem? And they said, well, we couldn't even make your deal in 12 days. And by this time I was just really impatient and I said, look, forget about my deal, forget about the credit, forget about the money. If we don't do this now, you won't have a movie. So are we in or out? Are we doing this list or what? And how come nobody ever reads a book? I yanked a book off the shelf in Star Trek. Do people no longer read in the 23rd century? I guess we're in the 21st century and they don't, but who knew? I had pulled down A Tale of Two Cities, the one book everybody knows the first and last lines of. And so that's how the thing got done, and that's what my name isn't on it. And then Bill comes into Harve's office and starts talking about this script is a disaster. And I can't remember a lot of what he's saying. All I remember is that my bladder kept filling up and I had to keep going out to the men's room. It was so scary and humiliating. And then finally he, sort of blew out of there. And I looked at Harv and said, well, that's that. And Harv, who had produced a lot of television, $6 Million Man and Mod Squad and Rich Man, Poor Man, and he said, well, let's break this down into bite-sized pieces. I told you I'm not good at analyzing things, but Harv was very good at it. And basically, I was going to have to learn how to write for a star. He's Captain Kirk, and he's got to be the first man through the door. So once Harv sort of explained to me what Bill had been fulminating about, I went, oh. And I went back, and in 12 hours, I turned the thing around and dropped it off at his doorstep. And it came back to a voicemail, one of those tape things. You're a genius. He went on and on and on. This is great. This is whatever. And it was so simple to fix what he had been talking about. Just make him the first man through the door. And I kept that voicemail. It was a little cassette. I was going to play it at him when I was having any trouble. That was my fantasy that I would do that. That was my sort of pre-experience with him. Then when we were doing the movie, the thing I learned about Bill is that Bill is a great actor, but he had done a lot of television, T.J. Hooker and stuff, and in my opinion, he'd gotten into some habits. So I had to figure out how to deal with those habits. I stumbled on the answer in a scene. It's the only scene that he plays with Khan. Khan demands something from Kirk. Kirk, meanwhile, is cooking up a mean surprise. And finally, he's got to say, here it comes, 3 words. And the first time Bill did it, it was like, here it comes. And I said, stop, Bill. This guy's really smart. He's gonna know something's afoot, you're doing something sneaky if you say it like that. Let's do it again. And the point was we did it about 4 times. And I always had an excuse, his focus was soft, the sound was bad, whatever. And eventually, he would get bored. And when he got bored, he got good. Because he stopped acting. He stopped striking attitudes. He just started being. You can look at it in the movie. And that was when I sort of unlocked the secret. And he may well have twigged that this was happening, but by that time we were clicking like an express train. I think one thing that may differentiate me as a director from a lot of, say, television directors, and in TV, if nobody falls down, you print it. But I came out of a theater background, and I liked to work with actors to shape performances. And to me, this is a lot of fun, but it's also part of the process. And I took pride in being able to shape Bill's performance and also Ricardo's. Directing Ricardo Montalban was the closest I've ever come to driving a Lamborghini. When we first staged Khan in the cargo bays, talking about why he's so enraged, Admiral Kirk never bothered to check on our progress. It was his first day on the set, and he had never been at rehearsals that we had all had because he was filming his TV series, so I didn't really know him. And actors are always wondering about the director. Is he crazy? Will I live? Do I have to pull the boat over the mountain? That kind of thing. So he was always very courtly. I had met him for lunch. I gave him a copy of Moby Dick. I said, read this, it's all there. First day, hit all the marks that I had designed for him, but he was yelling it at the top of his lungs. And I didn't know what to do. It was the second movie I'd ever directed. This guy's got credits a mile long in the movies. longer than anybody. So all I could think of to say was, okay, well, we've got the moves down. Let's talk a little bit about interpretation while they're doing the lighting. And we're sitting there, and he's waiting kind of in a neutral format. And I said, Laurence Olivier once said that an actor should never show an audience his top. Because once you show them your top, they know you got no place else to go. And I didn't know if he was going to hit me or, anything. And instead, this kind of smile crept across his face, and he said, "Oh, you're going to direct me. That's good." He said, "I need direction. I don't know what I'm doing up there." And then he started telling me stories about Mervyn LeRoy and this one and Richard Thorpe, and who just would do this, this, and this, and then move on. So that was the beginning of a very wonderful collaboration, and I might add also a friendship. I didn't have to direct Leonard as much. Highly intelligent and had a lot of time with Spock. The most interesting thing that he said to me when we were discussing the character, he said, "I never played Spock as a man with no emotions. I played him always as a man fighting to keep his emotions in check." I thought that was a very creative, imaginative, and also revealing remark, revealing of Leonard and his intelligence and his artistry. He had ambivalent feelings about Spock. First he wrote a book saying, "I am not Spock." Then he wrote a book saying, "I am Spock." I think he thought he was doing this movie in order not to do any more Spock. The shift that I noticed was the day we were filming his death scene. By this point, I think he, and perhaps catching the studio's enthusiasm for what they were seeing, had begun to feel a little more ambivalent about saying goodbye to this character. I don't know to what degree he analyzed or articulated his feelings. All I know was that the death scene was going to be tough for him, and he was testy and he was tense. He was tense. And we were filming the scene, and I looked at my cinematographer at one point to see how he was, and he had tears streaming down his face. And then I looked at the script supervisor. She had tears, and I'm looking all around. Everybody has tears except me, because I'm a dummy. Or my job was not to have the tears. Henry James said that life is hot, but art is cool. If you are the puppeteer, you cannot be out front sobbing at the performance. You must be dry-eyed backstage and make sure that the strings do not become tangled. So I was being dry-eyed and watching, how this was anything, intruding on being able to enjoy what was happening. And later, everybody, connected with Star Trek writes a memoir. So when I'm in bookstores, you remember bookstores, and I would see a Star Trek memoir, I always flip to the back to see if I'm in the index and what they said about me. So Leonard wrote a memoir, and so I looked up and I read his description about that day. And he said, "I was really furious with Nicholas Meyer because he came to the set dressed as Sherlock Holmes." Now, I've never dressed as Sherlock Holmes in my life. So I thought, what is he misremembering? And I started looking at stills from that day. And I was dressed in a three-piece suit because I'm a big opera fan, and at that point, LA didn't have its own opera. What was then the New York City Opera, which no longer exists, would come out for 3 weeks once a year to LA, and I would go every night. That's why I was wearing a suit, because in those days you got dressed to go to the opera. But he had remembered it or experienced it as Sherlock Holmes. I got cast in a movie because of that photograph. We were finishing shooting the Star Trek movie. And we're like shooting inserts and this, and I can't remember. We're getting to the end of it. Suddenly somebody says, it's a phone call. It's a casting director named Tony Howard. And she says, Nick, do you still act? That's kind of a trick question. Because how do you start a conversation like that? And the answer, by the way, was I was a bad actor in college. I tried to be an actor. I was no good at it. And so, of course, I say, well, sure. What do you mean? And she says, well, we're making a movie about the young Mae West. It's called the Mae West story. And we need someone to play the young George Raft. And I said, how big is the part? And she goes, it's kind of small. I said, how small? She said, it's one line. I said, perfect. And then I said, how did you get to me? What made you, She said, well, we saw a photograph of you with your suit and your hair slicked back, and you kind of look like him. So that's how I got cast. I couldn't even hit the mark for one line. We had a screening of the movie in which Spock dies, and that's that. And people were sobbing and whatever. And the way Harv put it was, we have to give him hope. And I said, hope for what? This is the story. And basically what they were tiptoeing around was the idea that they knew they wanted by this time to make more Star Trek movies, and they didn't want to do it without Spock, so how can Spock live? And me being the priggish purist that I was, I said, what you're proposing is unforgivable. A lot of people love this guy to death, and we're going to tell them at the end that after we've put them through this ringer, oh, this was just a dry hustle. He's not really dead. At the time, I just thought, no, that's really dirty pool. I'm not going to be part of that. So it was done over my, you should pardon the expression, dead body. They wrote that ending, and now looking back on it, I think, why was I making such a fuss? When the film was finished, there was a screening in the executive screening room for Barry Diller and Gary Nardino, who was the head of television. And it was under the television division's auspices that the film was made in a bid to save money. I mean, the first movie cost $45 million, and I think we were 11.2 or something, using all the leftover sets and things. And at the end of the screening, Barry Diller said, I didn't know this movie was about the death of Spock. You can't kill Spock. We were weeks away from opening, and we had been busting our balls, you should pardon the expression, to get the thing ready because we had such a late start. And I didn't go home. I slept in the editing room, and, so maybe I was a little more intemperate than usual. And I said, look, I was asked to do some reshoots on this movie, and I did them. We're not talking about the Spock part of it. I was asked to do some recuts, and I did them. But I've done all the reshooting and the recutting that I'm prepared to do. And if you want to change this movie about the death of Spock between now and when we open, that's your business. But I will be out front in Westwood with a sandwich board telling everybody what you did. And if you think that's a way to entice creative talent to Paramount Pictures, that's also your choice. And he looked at me, he was really angry. And I think my bowels were turning to water. But I was really strung out by this point. And they had changed the name of the movie and everything. And he finally got up and said, well, it's your damn movie. Maybe damn wasn't the word he used. And he walked out. Well, we broke a lot of records. And after we broke all these records, I put a new message on my voicemail. Hello, this is Michael Eisner. On behalf of Paramount Pictures, I would like to apologize to Nicholas Meyer for the shabby way some so stupid thing that I put on, because it never occurred to me that anybody from Paramount Pictures would call to congratulate me on the opening weekend. So I come home and I hear, after my message, I hear beep. Michael, this is Nicholas Meyer. I have to say, I thought this was a pretty funny message, but Barry Diller did not. Anyway, congratulations, or whatever it was he had called to say. Yeah, I was always putting my foot in it. Once you see how people react to the movie, any movie, first preview, first whatever, chances are, if you learn that it works, then it's always going to work. And that allows you to enjoy, instead of sitting or standing at the back chewing your fingers off, worrying about something, and then something you know, this is always going to get a laugh. This is always where people gasp and so forth. You can relax you can enjoy your movie as opposed to worrying about your movie. So yeah, we all went, I think it was in Times Square, it was on Broadway, somewhere around there. And we had a great time. My father had never even heard of Star Trek, so I had no idea what it was. That's why the movie starts off and it says, in the 23rd century, so my dad would know where we were. Ultimately, I realized it was also so I would know where we were. And then we waited up for the newspapers to come out with the reviews of the next day. What did the New York Times think? That was big suspense. Janet Maslin wrote it, and the first line was, "This is more like it." They offered me the next Star Trek movie, and I said, "What is that about?" And they said, "Well, Spock comes back to life." And I said, "Resurrection. I don't know how to do resurrection." And they said, "You don't want to do the movie?" I said, "I don't think so." The story was Harv and Leonard, and Harv and I split it up. He wrote the outer space parts, and I wrote the time after time parts. And I was just brought in at the last minute. That's when they bring me in. Relief pitcher. I became involved in 6 when I got a call from Martin Davis and Frank Mancuso, who were now running the studio. I was living in London. They came to London. They said, "We don't want to go out with 5. We want to do another one. Do you have any ideas?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, if you get any ideas, and we're talking about $30 million, and does that sound reasonable to you?" And I said, "Yeah." And so they went away. And then I had a meeting, because I went for my vacation, and I was on Cape Cod. And Leonard, who is a native of Boston, was in Boston, and he flew to the Cape, which was a 15-minute flight, and we walked up and down the beach and concocted what became Star Trek VI. And that's how I became involved in it. And then I ultimately wrote the script with Denny Martin Flynn. It has taken me 40 or however long it's been, years, to make my peace understanding Star Trek. Because I began, as I think we talked about, not understanding it at all. Then I went to a kind of a midpoint where I said, oh, this is Hornblower, this is the Navy in outer space. But it wasn't, I think for a number of years, that there was kind of an evolving comprehension of what was remarkable about this show and the ideas behind it. The idea that people of goodwill, of all stripes, genders, races, what have you, could come together to do good things. It took me a long time to get to that. I was sort of almost suspiciously obtuse, in the same way that Arthur Conan Doyle never really understood Sherlock Holmes. He could do it, but he didn't quite get it. And there were other things that he wrote, his science fiction and other things, that he invested a lot more emotion and energy into than Sherlock Holmes. He kept trying to kill him off. He got so sick of it. And I sort of learned from the Doyle example. I don't want to do that. I don't want to belittle something that seemed to mean so much to so many people, and also so many scientists. Every person at JPL gets their start from watching Star Trek. And I'm saying, you know what? It's like how I related to abstract expressionism. When I first saw abstract expressionism, I thought, gee, anybody could do this painting. And my girlfriend said, you know, a lot of people have been looking at this stuff for a lot longer than you, and maybe you should keep looking. So I did, until it began to make a kind of sense to me, and ultimately Star Trek does. I am so grateful that I got to be a part of this. It's been one of the major parts of my creative life, the fact that I stumbled into it, that I didn't know what it was or what I was doing, and that it somehow came out. I'm grateful. I don't knock it. It's a life work. Luck. Somebody recommended a general to Napoleon and said, this guy's a really good general. And Napoleon said, I know he's good. But is he lucky? You're looking at lucky.